You know, sometimes in history, something happens that just sounds completely impossible. Imagine a modern professional army. We're talking the latest rifles, artillery, the whole deal, facing an enemy with spears and cowhide shields. And that modern army gets completely, utterly wiped out. It sounds like fiction, but it really happened. So let's get into the incredible story of how one of the world's greatest military powers suffered one of its most shocking defeats. Okay, so picture this. The date is January 22nd, 1879. We're at a place called Isandlwana in southern Africa, and what you're seeing here is absolute chaos. British redcoats, armed with one of the best rifles of the day, the Martini Henry, are just being swallowed by this massive wave of Zulu warriors. This wasn't just a lost battle, it was the total annihilation of a huge part of the British invasion force. And that really brings us to the core question, the big mystery of this whole thing. How on earth did this happen? How could the army of the British Empire, an empire that spanned the entire globe, be so decisively beaten by a regional African kingdom? Well, to figure that out, we've got to unravel a story of huge ambition, fatal arrogance, and on the other side, some absolutely brilliant tactics. To really get what happened, first you have to understand the sheer scale of this disaster for the British. I mean, the numbers here are just mind-boggling. More than 1,300 British and colonial troops were killed. Now, to put that into perspective, this was the absolute worst defeat the British Army had ever suffered against an indigenous force. Entire companies were wiped out, down to the very last man. So this wasn't some minor setback. No, this was a full-blown catastrophe. So how was the defeat this total even possible? To get that, we have to rewind the clock a little bit. See, this war, it didn't just happen by accident. It was deliberately started. The main guy behind this was the British High Commissioner, a man named Sir Bartle Frere. He had this grand plan to create a British-controlled confederation in South Africa, but the powerful and independent Zulu kingdom was in his way. So he cooked up an ultimatum for the Zulu king with demands he knew were absolutely impossible to meet. The whole point was to provoke a war. And sure enough, when the deadline passed, the invasion began. This whole conflict was manufactured from the get-go. And this just lays out the massive imbalance of power. On one side, you've got the British Empire. You're talking about a global superpower with all the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. Modern rifles that loaded from the back, artillery, rockets. And on the other side, you have the Zulu Kingdom, a regional power whose warriors were armed mainly with their traditional iron-tipped spear, the assegai, and shields made out of cowhide. And this right here, this visual contrast, it just says it all, doesn't it? You have the professional British soldier in his red coat, part of a disciplined, globe-trotting war machine. And then you have the Zulu warrior. Looking at this, you can kind of see why the British were so confident, maybe even a little arrogant. On paper, it looks like there's just no contest. But the Zulus had their own deep warrior culture, and they were incredibly proud of how they fought. This quote gives you a peek into their mindset about guns. They saw them as the weapons of cowards, because true bravery was tested up close, face to face. So this wasn't just a clash of technologies, it was a clash of two totally different ways of thinking about war itself. That British confidence, well, it would soon curdle into a series of just catastrophic mistakes. You see, the Zulus didn't just win this battle. The British command basically handed them the opportunity on a silver platter. It was like a masterclass in what not to do. First, the British commander, Lord Chelmsford, completely underestimated his enemy. He just didn't think the Zulus could move that fast or fight that well. Second, he ignored standard procedure and didn't fortify his camp. He didn't circle the wagons into what's called a logger, a defensive barrier, because he thought it would take too much time. And then, the third and biggest mistake of all. On the morning of the battle, he split his army in half, taking a huge chunk of his forces on a wild goose chase, leaving the camp dangerously exposed. So get this, the man in charge leaves just 1,300 men to guard the entire camp because he was absolutely convinced that the main Zulu army was miles and miles away. What he had no idea about was that 20,000 Zulu warriors were quietly hiding in a valley just a few miles from his camp, just waiting. So, with the British camp left wide open and its commander off somewhere else, the stage was set for one of the most brilliant and downright terrifying attacks in military history. Now, the secret to Zulu's success was this incredible tactic, the horns of the buffalo. It's a genius envelopment maneuver.
You have a main central force called the chest that hits the enemy head-on to pin them down. But while they're distracted, two other columns, the horns, are sprinting around the sides to completely surround the enemy and attack from the flanks and the rear. It's devastating.
And at Isandlwana, they executed it perfectly. As soon as a British patrol stumbled upon them, the entire Zulu army sprang up. The chest slammed right into the British firing line, while the horns started their deadly run around the sides of the mountain, aiming to cut off any possible escape route. For an unfortified, spread-out camp like this one, it was the worst-case scenario. And you really can't talk about this battle without talking about speed. Just look at this. The British column, weighed down by huge supply wagons in the middle of a rainy season, was just crawling through the landscape. The Zulu army, on the other hand, could live off the land and moved with incredible speed. They covered 5 times the distance in half the time, and that speed is what gave them the crucial element of surprise. And then, right in the middle of all this chaos, something truly incredible happened. At the peak of the fighting, a solar eclipse occurred, and the whole battlefield was plunged into darkness. I mean, can you imagine the psychological effect? For the Zulu, it must have felt like a powerful sign from the heavens. And for the terrified British soldiers, it was like the world itself was ending as everything went dark around them. When the sun came back out, the battle was over. What was left was a scene of total devastation, and the shockwaves from this defeat would be felt thousands of miles away, all the way back in London. The final numbers are just awful. Over 1,300 men on the British and colonial side were killed. For the Zulus, it was a spectacular victory, but it came at a truly terrible cost. We don't know the exact number, but it's estimated that somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 of their own warriors died. It was a bloodbath for everyone involved. And if you were to visit the battlefield today, you'd see the landscape is dotted with these white stone piles, these cairns. Each one of them marks a mass grave where British soldiers were buried, right where they fell. It's a very quiet, very somber place that serves as a powerful reminder of just how brutal that day was. So what's the big takeaway here? Well, first, the battle completely shattered the initial British invasion. Second, the shock and sheer embarrassment back in London was so great that they sent massive reinforcements to, in their words, restore British honor. But they also learned a brutal lesson, one written in blood. You never, ever underestimate your opponent. The British army would never again fight the main Zulu force in the open without digging in and fortifying their position first. Which really leaves us with one final big question. Is victory always about having the better technology, or can it all come down to the simple, timeless, and often fatal flaw of just being too arrogant and underestimating who you're up against?